In the smoke-choked final years of World War II, as cities crumbled and armies bled across three continents, desperate minds turned to weapons that belonged more to fever dreams than reality. Engineers and scientists, working in secret laboratories and hidden facilities, raced against an ever-ticking clock to build instruments of destruction so powerful, so revolutionary, that they could tilt the balance of the entire war. Some of these weapons were nearly completed. Others were loaded, tested, and waiting for the order to deploy. And a few were just hours away from being unleashed upon an unsuspecting world. But then something happened. Orders were countermanded. Resources were diverted. Time ran out, and these weapons, for reasons both deliberate and accidental, never saw the light of day. Tonight we're going to explore the most dangerous weapons of World War II that came within a hair's breadth of being used, but were canceled at the very last moment. These aren't the failed experiments or the impractical fantasies that never left the drawing board. These are the weapons that were real, that were viable, and that, had circumstances been just slightly different, might have changed the course of human history. The Nazi sun gun, death from the heavens. Imagine looking up at the night sky and seeing not stars, but a weapon. A massive orbital mirror suspended in the blackness of space, capable of concentrating the sun's fury into a beam of destruction that could reduce entire cities to ash. This wasn't science fiction. This was Nazi Germany's sun gun, and it came far closer to reality than most people realize. The story begins in 1929, long before the war, when German physicist Hermann Oberth published a visionary book called Ways to Spaceflight. Oberth was a pioneer, a dreamer who imagined humanity's future among the stars. In his book, he proposed the construction of a space station equipped with a massive concave mirror, 100 meters wide. His intention was peaceful. This mirror would concentrate sunlight to generate electricity through steam turbines, perhaps to provide light to dark regions of the Earth or to aid in meteorological observations. It was an optimistic vision of what space technology could accomplish for the betterment of mankind. But when war clouds gathered over Europe and the Nazi regime seized control of Germany, Oberth's peaceful dream was twisted into something far more sinister. By the early 1940s, as the tide of war began to turn against Germany, Nazi scientists at the artillery proving grounds in Hillersleben seized upon Oberth's concept and reimagined it as the ultimate weapon of mass destruction. They called it the Sonnengewehr, the sun gun. The Nazi version was nothing like Oberth's benevolent vision. They envisioned a colossal space station positioned approximately 5,100 miles above the Earth's surface. At this altitude, the station would maintain a stable orbit while serving as a platform for what they believed would be the most devastating weapon ever conceived. The centerpiece would be an enormous reflector made of metallic sodium and covering an area of 9 square kilometers, roughly 3.5 square miles. This gigantic mirror would capture and focus the sun's rays into a concentrated beam of heat so intense that it could, theoretically, accomplish the impossible. According to the Nazi scientists' calculations, this focused beam of solar energy could boil portions of an ocean. It could burn entire cities to ashes in minutes. It could incinerate armies where they stood, leaving nothing but scorched earth and shadows. The weapon would be silent, invisible until the moment it struck, and utterly unstoppable by any defensive measure humanity possessed at the time. There would be no warning, no time to evacuate, no shelter that could protect against concentrated sunlight amplified 1,000-fold. The plans were detailed, frighteningly so. The space station itself would be a marvel of engineering, equipped with living quarters for a crew of Nazi astronauts. These men would wear magnetic boots to work in the weightless environment of space, maintaining and operating the weapon that held the world hostage. To sustain the crew, the station would feature vast onboard greenhouses filled with pumpkin plants, chosen because they consumed carbon dioxide efficiently and produced the oxygen needed for human survival. Electricity would be generated by steam-driven dynamos that utilized the raw power of solar radiation. The crew would receive their targeting orders via radio or wireless telegraph, and with a simple adjustment of the mirror's angle, they could direct their beam of destruction anywhere on Earth. The technical challenges were staggering. To construct such a station, the Germans would need to develop rockets far more advanced than anything they possessed. Their most sophisticated achievement? The V-2 rocket could barely reach the edge of space in a suborbital trajectory. It lacked both the payload capacity and the range to reach the proposed orbital altitude, let alone deliver the prefabricated sections required to construct a massive space station. The Nazis envisioned using an upgraded version called the A-11, a multi-stage rocket being developed at Peenemünde by Werner von Braun, the same man who would later help America reach the moon. But even this advanced rocket existed only in preliminary designs. The construction process would have been a nightmare of complexity. Workers would need to assemble the station piece by piece in the vacuum of space, a feat that wouldn't become reality until the 1970s with the first true space stations. The mirror itself would require precision engineering on a scale never before attempted. Any flaw in its curvature, any misalignment in its positioning, would render the weapon ineffective. And then there was the simple matter of resources. Germany, by 1943, was a nation running on fumes. Fuel shortages had crippled the Luftwaffe. Allied bombing raids were systematically destroying German industry. The country could barely produce enough tanks and rifles to equip its armies, let alone divert the astronomical resources needed to build a space station. When Allied forces overran Germany in 1945 and discovered the Sun Gun plans, they were simultaneously horrified and skeptical. Later analysis by Allied scientists revealed additional flaws that the Germans had apparently overlooked or ignored in their desperation. The beam's intensity would likely dissipate over such a vast distance. Some physicists calculated that instead of an apocalyptic death ray, the focused sunlight would create conditions more akin to, as one scientist dryly noted, a pleasant spring day on the ground below. The atmosphere itself would scatter and absorb much of the energy. Clouds would block it entirely, and targeting would be nightmarishly difficult from an orbital platform. Yet the terrifying truth remains: the concept was seriously considered. Money was allocated. Engineers drew up blueprints. Calculations were made. The Nazis believed, or at least hoped, that this weapon was possible. When questioned by Allied officers after the war, German scientists claimed that the Sun Gun could have been completed within 50 to 100 years, given adequate resources. It was a weapon ahead of its time, conceived by minds driven to the edge by desperation and ideology. And the world was lucky, profoundly lucky, that it never advanced beyond the planning stage. Japan's silent terror, the Fugo balloon bombs. While Germany dreamed of death rays from space, Japan turned to a weapon that was both elegantly simple and devastatingly clever. They would harness the wind itself as an instrument of war. In 1944, Japanese meteorologists made a discovery that would lead to one of the war's most unusual weapons: a powerful, high-altitude air current flowing directly from Japan toward North America. Today we call it the jet stream. To the Japanese military, it was a highway to deliver terror to the American homeland. The weapon they developed was the Fugo, which translates to windship weapon, though history would come to know them as balloon bombs. The concept was remarkable in its simplicity. Each bomb consisted of a massive hydrogen-filled balloon, 33 feet in diameter, constructed from layers of mulberry paper glued together with paste made from Japanese potatoes. Suspended beneath this balloon was a sophisticated payload system carrying 4 incendiary bombs and one 33-pound high-explosive anti-personnel bomb. The engineering behind these balloons was far more advanced than their paper construction might suggest. Each Fugo was equipped with an ingenious automatic altitude control device. As the balloon rose and fell on its trans-Pacific journey, this mechanism would release sandbag ballast when the balloon sank too low, keeping it in the optimal altitude range of the jet stream. Once all the ballast had been deployed, the balloon would automatically release its bombs and then self-destruct, eliminating evidence and preventing the enemy from studying the weapon's design. The entire journey from launch sites on the Japanese coast to the forests of North America would take approximately 70 hours. The Japanese military's goals were twofold. First, they hoped to ignite massive forest fires across the Pacific Northwest of the United States and Canada. The region's vast forests, thick with ancient trees and dry undergrowth, would burn uncontrollably, tying up military and civilian resources, costing millions of dollars in damages, and potentially disrupting the American war effort. Second, and perhaps more importantly, they aimed to create panic among the American civilian population. The psychological impact of enemy weapons striking the continental United States would, they believed, undermine American morale and potentially force concessions from the U.S. government. Between November of 1944 and April of 1945, Japan launched approximately 9,000 of these balloon bombs into the jet stream. It was a massive undertaking, requiring the labor of thousands of workers, many of them schoolgirls conscripted to paste together the delicate paper panels that formed each balloon's skin. Launch sites were established along the eastern coast of Honshu, and crews worked around the clock to send wave after wave of these silent attackers eastward across the Pacific. The results were mixed. Many balloons were lost over the ocean. Some failed to reach their targets. Others released their bombs over uninhabited wilderness, where they caused no damage. But some did get through. The first balloon was spotted floating off the coast of San Pedro, California, on November 4th, 1944, just a day after the first launches. By the summer of 1945, nearly 300 incidents involving fallen balloons or balloon fragments had been recorded across 26 states, as well as Canada and Mexico. Balloons reached as far east as Michigan and as far south as northern Mexico, demonstrating the incredible range of this unconventional weapon. Most of these incidents caused no casualties. A balloon bomb exploded in Medford, Oregon, in January of 1945, digging a shallow crater and shooting flames 20 feet into the air. But no one was hurt. Another struck a high-tension wire on the Bonneville Power Administration line, causing a brief power outage at the Hanford site, where scientists were working on the Manhattan Project. The plant lost about 2 days of production, but backup systems kicked in and prevented any serious disruption. But then came May 5th, 1945. It was a beautiful Saturday morning in rural Oregon, 3 days before the end of the war in Europe and just 3 months before Japan's surrender. Reverend Archie Mitchell, a young minister at the Christian and Missionary Alliance Church in the tiny logging community of Bly, decided to take his pregnant wife Elsie and 5 children from his Sunday school class on a fishing and picnic trip to Gearhart Mountain in the Fremont National Forest. Mitchell parked the car, and Elsie, along with the children, ranging in age from 11 to 14, walked ahead toward Leonard Creek, while the Reverend dealt with the vehicle. Suddenly, Elsie called out, "Look what we found, dear!" She and the children had discovered something unusual in the forest, a deflated balloon with strange markings, lying partially covered by snow and pine needles. The children, naturally curious, gathered around the mysterious object. Perhaps one of them reached down to touch it. Perhaps they tried to move it or examine it more closely. The balloon bomb exploded. When the smoke cleared and the Reverend reached the scene, he found himself standing over 6 bodies. Elsie Mitchell, 5 months pregnant with their first child, was dead. Sherman Shoemaker, Edward Engen, Jay Gifford, and siblings Joan and Dick Patsky, all in their early teens, had been killed instantly. They became the only civilians killed by enemy action on the continental United States during World War II, victims of a weapon that had traveled 6,000 miles to find them. The tragedy of the Bly incident was compounded by cruel irony. The Japanese military had actually canceled the Fugo program several weeks earlier. They had done so because they believed the weapon had failed completely. And they believed it had failed because of one of the most successful censorship campaigns in American history. From the very beginning, the U.S. government recognized the danger these balloon bombs posed, not from their destructive power, which was limited, but from the panic they could create if news of their existence became widespread. On January 4, 1945, the Office of Censorship sent a confidential memo to newspaper editors and radio broadcasters across the country, asking them to give no publicity whatsoever to balloon incidents. The cooperation was, in the words of the Office of Censorship, excellent. News stories were killed. Radio reports were silenced. When balloons were found, the discoveries were kept secret. This wall of silence had exactly the intended effect. Japanese military officials, listening to American radio broadcasts and reading whatever American newspapers they could obtain, heard nothing about their balloon bombs. They assumed the weapons were failing to reach North America. After all, if thousands of balloons were successfully striking the United States, surely there would be some mention of it in the news. Finding no evidence of success and facing increasing difficulties in obtaining the hydrogen and other materials needed to construct the balloons due to American bombing raids, the Japanese High Command decided the program was worthless. They ceased launches in April of 1945. And then, weeks after the program ended, the children in Bly found a balloon that had been lying dormant in the forest for months, waiting silently like a trap until curious hands disturbed it. After the Bly tragedy, the U.S. government could no longer maintain complete silence. On May 22, 1945, the War Department issued a carefully worded statement confirming the bomb's origin and warning the public to report but not touch any suspicious objects they might find. But by then, Germany had just surrendered, and the news of 6 deaths in rural Oregon was overshadowed by the dizzying pace of events in the European theater. The strange mechanism that had killed them received little attention beyond local communities. The balloon bombs continue, to be found occasionally even today, silent reminders of a weapon that was canceled just before it might have claimed many more victims. America's strangest weapon, the bat bomb. Yes, this was real. The United States military, with full presidential approval, developed a weapon that used live bats as delivery systems for incendiary bombs. The mere concept sounds absurd, like something from a cartoon or a pulp fiction novel. But Project X-Ray, as it was officially designated, was deadly serious. Backed by rigorous scientific research, and according to tests, would have been devastatingly effective against Japanese cities. The story begins in December of 1941, when Dr. Lytle S. Adams, a dental surgeon from Pennsylvania, was on vacation in New Mexico. Adams had professional connections to First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, which would prove crucial to his plan's success. During his vacation, he visited the world-famous Carlsbad Caverns, where he witnessed one of nature's most spectacular displays, millions of Mexican free-tailed bats emerging from the caverns at dusk, creating a living tornado that darkened the sky. Then came news of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Adams, like millions of Americans, was shocked and outraged. But unlike most Americans, Adams's mind immediately connected the bats he had just witnessed with a possible method of retaliating against Japan. He knew that Japanese cities were constructed primarily of wood, bamboo, and paper, materials that would burn readily. He knew that bats were incredibly strong for their size and could carry significant weight relative to their body mass. He knew that bats instinctively sought out dark spaces during daylight hours, roosting in attics, eaves, and the hidden spaces within buildings. And he knew that bats were nocturnal, meaning they would be flying and seeking roosts just before dawn. Adams envisioned dropping thousands of bats, each carrying a tiny incendiary device with a time delay fuse, over Japanese cities at dawn. The bats would scatter across a radius of 20 to 40 miles, seeking shelter from the approaching daylight. They would roost in buildings throughout the city, in spaces that were inaccessible to firefighters and impossible to monitor. Then, after the bats had settled, the incendiary devices would ignite simultaneously, starting thousands of small fires throughout the urban area. The fires would be in attics, in walls, in crawl spaces, locations where they could establish themselves before being discovered. By the time residents realized their city was burning, the fires would be out of control. Adams wrote to the White House in January of 1942, little more than a month after Pearl Harbor. His letter reached President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who, despite the outlandish nature of the proposal, saw potential in the concept. Roosevelt wrote to Colonel William J. Donovan, head of wartime intelligence. "This man is not a nut. It sounds like a perfectly wild idea, but is worth looking into." After review by military officials, cabinet members, and even bat experts, all agreed that if executed competently, the bat bomb would have a chance of success. The military took over the project, initially under the U.S. Air Force and later transferred to the Navy, which designated it Project X-ray. A team was assembled, led by Adams himself, to overcome the numerous technical challenges the concept presented. The first challenge was selecting the right species of bat. After testing several candidates, they settled on the Mexican free-tailed bat. Though relatively small, weighing about half an ounce, these bats could carry approximately twice their body weight. More importantly, they were abundant. Carlsbad Caverns alone hosted millions of them. The second challenge was creating an incendiary device small enough for a bat to carry, but powerful enough to start a fire. Enter Dr. Louis Fieser, a Harvard chemist who had just invented napalm, a gel-like incendiary substance that burned with intense heat and was extremely difficult to extinguish. Fieser developed a small celluloid capsule designated the H2 unit, which contained napalm and a time delay fuse. The entire device weighed less than 1 ounce. It was attached to the bat's chest using a surgical clip and adhesive. The third challenge was deployment. The team developed a bomb-shaped casing, approximately 5 feet long, that could hold over 1,000 bats in circular trays designed like egg cartons. The bats would be placed in these trays while in a state of induced hibernation, achieved by refrigeration. The bomb would be dropped from a high altitude, deploying a parachute at around 1,000 feet. As the casing descended slowly, the sides would fall away, exposing the bats to warming air. The theory was that the bats would wake from hibernation, fly away from the falling casing, and begin searching for roosts. As they exited the carrier, a mechanism would activate the 30-minute time delay fuses on their incendiary devices. Testing was extensive and often chaotic. Early attempts saw many bats fail to wake from hibernation in time, plummeting to the ground still asleep. Some carriers malfunctioned, failing to open properly or opening too soon. The adhesive sometimes failed, causing bats to lose their bombs in mid-flight. But the team persisted, refining their techniques through hundreds of tests. And then came the incident that would become part of military legend. During a test at the Carlsbad Army Airfield Auxiliary Base in New Mexico, some bats equipped with live incendiary devices were accidentally released prematurely. The bats, doing exactly what they were supposed to do, flew off and found roosts in the nearest available buildings, which happened to be structures at the brand new airbase, an air traffic control tower, barracks, and several other facilities. When the 30-minute fuses expired, the bats' napalm devices ignited. To maintain the secrecy of the project, firefighting resources were not immediately deployed. By the time the fires were brought under control, significant portions of the new base had burned to the ground. The base commander was reportedly furious. But from a technical standpoint, the test was an overwhelming success. It proved that the concept worked. Observers were impressed. The chief of incendiary testing at Dugway Proving Ground wrote in his report, "A reasonable number of destructive fires can be started in spite of the extremely small size of the units. The main advantage of the units would seem to be their placement within the enemy structures without the knowledge of the householder or fire watchers, thus allowing the fire to establish itself before being discovered." The National Defense Research Committee observer concluded, "It was concluded that X-ray is an effective weapon." The chief chemist's report went further, comparing the bat bomb favorably to conventional incendiary weapons. On a weight basis, X-ray was more effective than the standard incendiary bombs in use at the time. The regular bombs would give probably 167 to 400 fires per bomb load, where X-ray would give 3,625 to 4,748 fires. By mid-1944, the bat bomb was nearly ready for deployment. More advanced incendiary devices had been ordered. Final testing was scheduled. The weapon had proven itself effective beyond anyone's initial expectations. And then, abruptly, it was all over. Fleet Admiral Ernest J. King, upon learning that the Bat bomb would not be combat-ready until mid-1945, made the decision to cancel the project. By that time, approximately $2 million had been spent, equivalent to roughly $35 million today. But the money wasn't the issue. The timeline was, because another secret project, one with far greater destructive potential, was progressing faster than anyone had anticipated. The Manhattan Project was nearing completion. The atomic bomb was almost ready. The Bat bomb couldn't compete with the atomic bomb's promise of ending the war quickly and decisively. Resources and attention shifted to the weapon that could destroy an entire city with a single detonation, rather than the weapon that would destroy a city over the course of hours through thousands of small fires. Project X-ray was quietly shelved, its files classified, its success mostly forgotten. Dr. Adams, to his credit, later expressed profound regret about the path history had taken. After seeing the devastation wrought by the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he wrote, "Think of thousands of fires breaking out simultaneously over a circle of 40 miles in diameter for every bomb dropped. Japan could have been devastated, yet with small loss of life." Whether he was right, whether the Bat bomb would indeed have caused less loss of civilian life than the atomic bombs, is a question history will never answer. The world chose nuclear fire over the silent spread of a million tiny flames. Germany's sonic nightmare. Among the catalog of bizarre weapons pursued by Nazi Germany in their desperate final years, few sound as much like science fiction as the sonic cannon. Yet this weapon was real, tested, and according to some reports, capable of killing a human being through sound alone. It represented an attempt to weaponize one of the fundamental forces of nature, acoustic energy at frequencies and intensities the human body was never meant to withstand. The weapon was the brainchild of Dr. Richard Wallauschek, an Austrian scientist working for the Nazi war machine. His design centered on a methane gas combustion chamber, connected to a series of subunit firing tubes. These tubes would mix methane and oxygen in precise ratios, then ignite them in rapid succession. The combustion would occur at a carefully controlled frequency of approximately 44 cycles per second, or 44 hertz. Each explosion would create a powerful pressure wave, and these waves would be directed through two enormous parabolic reflector dishes, each with a diameter of nearly 10 feet. The theory was elegant and terrifying. The parabolic dishes would focus and amplify the sound waves, creating a concentrated beam of acoustic energy. This beam, when directed at a human target, would cause a cascade of devastating physiological effects. At ranges of 200 to 400 meters, the sound waves would vibrate the tiny bones of the middle ear and shake the cochlear fluid within the inner ear, causing intense vertigo, nausea, and disorientation. A soldier caught in the beam would become instantly incapacitated, unable to maintain balance or coordination, but at closer ranges, the effects became far more sinister. At distances of 50 to 200 meters, the sound waves were calculated to be powerful enough to act directly on organ tissues and body fluids. The weapon worked by repeatedly compressing and releasing organs that resist compression, such as the kidneys, spleen, and liver. Unlike malleable organs like the heart, stomach, and intestines, which could flex and absorb the pressure waves, these denser organs would be subjected to extreme mechanical stress with each pulse of the sonic beam. Lung tissue could be affected at the closest ranges, though atmospheric air is highly compressible, and only the blood-rich alveoli would resist compression enough to be damaged. At the weapon's maximum intensity, at ranges of approximately 50 meters, exposure for just 30 seconds was theoretically lethal. The sound waves would create pressures exceeding 1,000 millibars, well above the threshold that human physiology can endure. Internal bleeding, ruptured organs, and catastrophic tissue damage would result. The victim would essentially be shaken apart from the inside, though their external appearance might show little evidence of the trauma. Laboratory tests were apparently conducted using animals, though documentation is scarce and accounts vary. Some reports suggest that test subjects, likely small mammals, died from internal bleeding when exposed to the device. The Germans claimed the weapon worked and were preparing to deploy it against Allied forces. But the sonic cannon faced several insurmountable problems that ultimately led to its abandonment. First, the weapon was extraordinarily vulnerable to enemy fire. The large parabolic reflectors were essential to the weapon's function, but they were also fragile. Any damage to these dishes would render the entire system useless. A single artillery shell, a strafing run by an aircraft, even small arms fire at close range could destroy the reflectors and turn the sonic cannon into an expensive piece of scrap metal. Second, the weapon's effective range was severely limited. Even at its theoretical maximum effectiveness, the sonic cannon could only project its deadly beam a few hundred meters. Modern rifles could engage targets at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. Artillery could strike from miles away. Aircraft could bomb from altitudes the sound beam could never reach. A sonic cannon crew would be sitting ducks, operating a large, conspicuous weapon that could only harm enemies who came very close. Third, the weapon was slow to aim and difficult to target effectively. The parabolic dishes needed to be precisely aligned with the target to achieve maximum effect. A moving target or multiple targets spread across a battlefield would be nearly impossible to engage effectively, and unlike bullets or shells, sound doesn't travel in a perfectly straight line. It can be deflected by terrain, absorbed by materials, and scattered by atmospheric conditions. Finally, and perhaps most critically, the weapon required constant power and fuel. The methane combustion system needed a steady supply of both gases, and maintaining the precise 44 Hz firing rate required careful calibration. In the chaos of combat, with supply lines under attack and maintenance facilities destroyed by bombing, keeping the sonic cannon operational would be nearly impossible. Allied forces discovered one of the sonic cannon prototypes when they overran the artillery proving grounds at Hillersleben in 1945. It was found rusted and abandoned, having never been deployed in combat. A second prototype had been destroyed by the Germans themselves at the war's end, likely to prevent it from falling into Allied hands. The weapon joined the long list of Nazi wonder weapons, or Wunderwaffe, that had promised to turn the tide of war, but instead consumed resources that might have been better spent on conventional armaments. Modern acoustic weapons do exist, though they're far more sophisticated than the Nazi sonic cannon. Devices like the long-range acoustic device can project painful sound at specific targets for crowd control purposes, but these weapons are carefully calibrated to cause discomfort without inflicting permanent harm. The Nazi vision of using sound to kill, to rupture organs, and cause internal bleeding through acoustic energy alone remains in the realm of theoretical possibility rather than practical application. The human body is simultaneously more resilient and more fragile than the German scientists understood, and weaponizing sound at lethal intensities proved far more difficult than they anticipated. The weapon too dark to use: radiological warfare. As World War II drew toward its conclusion and the first atomic bombs were being assembled in the secret laboratories of the Manhattan Project, some scientists began contemplating a weapon that was, in many ways, more horrifying than nuclear fire itself. This weapon wouldn't destroy cities in a blinding flash of light and heat. Instead, it would poison them silently, making entire regions uninhabitable for decades or even centuries, killing slowly and invisibly through radiation exposure. It was the radiological weapon, what we now call a dirty bomb, and the fact that it was seriously considered, researched, and ultimately rejected tells us something important about the moral boundaries that existed even in the midst of total war. The concept emerged early in the Manhattan Project, when scientists first began to understand the implications of nuclear fission. In the summer of 1942, Arthur Compton, head of the University of Chicago's Metallurgical Laboratory, wrote a classified memo to James B. Conant, president of Harvard and a key figure in the atomic bomb program. Compton's memo expressed concern about what he called ionizing bombs, weapons designed to spread radioactive materials in lethal quantities. His worry wasn't that the United States would build such weapons, it was that Germany might already be doing so. American intelligence believed that Germany was pursuing nuclear research and might have operational nuclear reactors. If they did, they would have access to intensely radioactive spent fuel rods. This material could be weaponized without requiring the complex and difficult process of creating a nuclear chain reaction. A conventional explosive could be used to scatter the radioactive material over a wide area, contaminating everything it touched. Buildings, streets, water supplies, soil, all would become radioactive. People exposed to the fallout would receive doses of radiation that could kill them within days or weeks. Those who survived the initial exposure might develop cancers years or decades later. The contaminated area would need to be abandoned or subjected to an enormously expensive cleanup process. The fear of German radiological weapons was serious enough that the Allied forces established Operation Peppermint, a program to develop and distribute radiation detection equipment to troops in preparation for the D-Day landings. Thousands of Geiger counters, film packets, and other radiation survey meters were produced and deployed, ready to detect any radiological attack the Germans might launch. The soldiers carrying this equipment had no idea what they were meant to detect or why. The existence of radioactive materials and the concept of radiological warfare were classified secrets. But as the Manhattan Project progressed and American scientists gained a deeper understanding of nuclear materials, some began to consider whether the United States itself should develop radiological weapons. The arguments in favor were pragmatic and cold-blooded. If nuclear fission proved impossible to tame into a working bomb, radiological weapons could serve as a backup plan. They would be easier and cheaper to produce than atomic bombs, requiring no critical mass, no complex implosion mechanisms, and no exotic trigger systems. Simply pack radioactive material around conventional explosives and detonate. The effects would be different from an atomic bomb, but in some scenarios possibly more valuable. An atomic bomb destroys everything in its blast radius and leaves behind a crater. A radiological weapon, by contrast, would leave infrastructure largely intact while making the area uninhabitable. Factories, bridges, roads, and buildings would remain standing, but no one could safely use them. An enemy trying to occupy or cross through the contaminated zone would sicken and die. It would be the ultimate area denial weapon. Yet despite these apparent advantages, the United States chose not to pursue radiological weapons as a primary option during World War II. Several factors contributed to this decision. Some scientists and policymakers argued that radiological weapons would constitute chemical weapons under international law and would therefore be prohibited by existing treaties. The United States, they insisted, should not be the first to violate these agreements, even if the enemy might not share such scruples. Others pointed to the practical difficulties. Radioactive materials are dangerous to handle and transport. Creating a radiological weapon would expose the workers manufacturing it to significant radiation doses. Deploying the weapon would require special precautions to protect friendly forces from contamination. And unlike an atomic bomb, whose effects could be calculated with reasonable precision, the long-term consequences of widespread radiological contamination were largely unknown. How long would the affected area remain dangerous? Would rain wash the radioactive material into rivers and groundwater, spreading the contamination far beyond the target zone? Would crops grown in nearby fields become radioactive? Would the air itself carry radioactive dust to distant cities? There were also ethical considerations, though these were rarely stated explicitly in official documents. An atomic bomb killed quickly. The victims at Ibe Ground Zero had no time to suffer, but radiological weapons killed slowly, through radiation sickness that could last for days or weeks. Victims would experience nausea, vomiting, hair loss, internal bleeding, and organ failure. There would be no quick death, no instant vaporization, just prolonged agony for those unfortunate enough to be exposed. Perhaps most importantly, the moral ambiguity of radiological weapons made them politically difficult to deploy. An atomic bomb, for all its horror, at least had the virtue of ending the war quickly. It demonstrated overwhelming force that made further resistance seem futile. A radiological weapon, by contrast, would appear to be nothing more than poison, a weapon chosen not for its military effectiveness, but for its capacity to inflict suffering. Using such a weapon might turn neutral nations against the United States and provide powerful propaganda for the enemy. In May of 1945, before the Trinity test, American scientists conducted what might be considered the only radiological weapons test in history. At a remote site, they detonated 108 tons of conventional explosives mixed with a single irradiated fuel slug from the Hanford reactor. The explosion scattered radioactive material over a wide area, contaminating the test site to levels exceeding 1,400 curies. The test confirmed that radiological weapons were technically feasible. The material could be dispersed effectively, and the resulting contamination was significant. But the test also highlighted the weapon's limitations. The amount of radioactive material required to create lethal contamination over a large area was substantial. The material had to be in a form that could be readily dispersed as fine particles. Otherwise, it would simply fall to the ground near the blast site in relatively harmless chunks. And even with optimal dispersal, the affected area would be measured in hundreds or thousands of meters, not miles. 2. Contaminate an entire city would require dozens or hundreds of radiological weapons, far less efficient than a single atomic bomb. By the time the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945, the concept of radiological weapons had been largely abandoned. The atomic bomb had proven itself as the ultimate weapon, the device that could end the war in a single stroke. There was no need for the half measure of a dirty bomb when the full measure of atomic fire was available. After the war, radiological weapons were briefly reconsidered during the early Cold War period. Both the United States and the Soviet Union conducted research into various types of radiological dispersal devices. The U.S. Army Chemical Corps tested prototypes of dust generators and air-delivered bomblets designed to spread radioactive contamination over enemy territory. But as nuclear arsenals grew and tactical nuclear weapons became available, interest in radiological weapons waned. Why use a weapon that only contaminates an area when you can use one that destroys it completely? The legacy of World War II radiological weapon research lives on in modern concerns about dirty bombs and radiological terrorism. The ease with which radioactive materials can be obtained from medical or industrial sources, combined with the relative simplicity of building a radiological dispersal device, makes dirty bombs a persistent worry for security agencies worldwide. But no nation has ever deployed operational radiological weapons in combat. The moral line that scientists and policymakers drew in the final years of World War II has so far held. When history held its breath. World War II wasn't only a conflict of armies clashing on battlefields or fleets engaging on the open ocean. It was a race between imagination and restraint, between the impulse to develop ever more terrible weapons and the recognition that some weapons were too dangerous, too unpredictable, or simply too morally compromising to use. The weapons we've explored tonight, the ones that came so close to deployment but were ultimately canceled, represent the paths not taken, the horrors that almost were. Consider what might have happened if circumstances had been just slightly different. If Germany had possessed adequate resources and a few more years, the sun gun might have moved from blueprint to reality. An orbital death ray would have changed the nature of warfare fundamentally, making every city on Earth vulnerable to attack from an unassailable platform in space. The arms race that followed would have been terrifying to contemplate. If the U.S. government had not implemented its censorship campaign, Japan would have known that the Fugo balloon bombs were reaching American soil. They would have continued and perhaps expanded the program, launching tens of thousands more balloons. Instead of 6 tragic deaths in Oregon, there might have been hundreds or thousands of casualties across North America as balloon bombs fell on cities, forests, and farms. The panic and disruption would have been significant. If the Manhattan Project had encountered insurmountable obstacles, if nuclear fission had proven impossible to weaponize quickly enough, the bat bomb might have become America's primary means of attacking Japanese cities. Millions of bats, each carrying its tiny burden of napalm, would have been dropped over Tokyo, Osaka, Kyoto, and Nagasaki. Thousands of simultaneous fires would have consumed these cities over hours, instead of the seconds it took atomic bombs to do the same. The death toll might have been comparable, the suffering certainly longer, if Germany's sonic cannon had been more effective, more robust, and deployed earlier in the war. It might have changed the nature of infantry combat. Soldiers would have faced an invisible weapon that could incapacitate or kill without the warning of bullets or the whistle of incoming shells. The psychological impact of such a weapon would have been profound. And if radiological weapons had become the norm rather than the exception, if both sides had deployed dirty bombs liberally throughout the war, Europe might still bear radioactive scars today. Cities that were merely destroyed by conventional bombing could have been poisoned for generations. The continent might have become a patchwork of uninhabitable zones, making post-war reconstruction infinitely more difficult. But none of these scenarios came to pass. In each case, whether through deliberate choice, fortunate accident, or simple lack of time, these weapons were canceled before they could be unleashed. Sometimes the decision was made for practical reasons. The weapon didn't work well enough, it was too expensive, or a better alternative became available. Sometimes it was made for moral reasons. The weapon crossed a line that even desperate nations were unwilling to cross. And sometimes it was made by circumstance. The war ended before the weapon could be completed, or resources ran out before it could be deployed. These canceled weapons remind us that war, for all its chaos and destruction, still operates within certain boundaries. Not all terrible ideas become terrible realities. Not every weapon that can be built should be built. And sometimes, just sometimes, restraint wins out over the impulse to destroy at any cost. The engineers and scientists who worked on these projects weren't monsters. They were people doing what they believed was necessary to defend their nations and win the war. But they were also people capable of recognizing, at least in some cases, when they had gone too far. The American scientists who argued against radiological weapons despite their military utility were making a moral choice. The German scientists who told Allied interrogators that the sun gun would take 50 to 100 years to complete may have been exaggerating the timeline, intentionally or not, to discourage any nation from pursuing such a weapon. As we look back from our vantage point in the 21st century, we can be grateful that these particular weapons of World War II remained unused. We can wonder what other weapons might have been developed if the war had lasted longer. And we can take away a lesson about the importance of restraint, even in the midst of the most destructive conflict in human history. The weapons that were almost used but canceled at the last moment are more than just historical curiosities. They're reminders that the future is not inevitable, that decisions matter, and that sometimes the most important battles are the ones fought in laboratories and conference rooms rather than on battlefields. Every time scientists and leaders chose not to deploy one of these terrible weapons, they were choosing what kind of world we would inherit. And we should all be thankful that they chose as they did. If you found this exploration of history's near misses as fascinating, as we did, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that like button. There are countless more stories from World War II waiting to be told. Stories of bravery and cowardice, innovation and destruction, choices made and paths not taken. We'll be bringing you those stories, and we hope you'll join us for the journey. Until next time, remember that history is not just what happened, it's also what almost happened. And the difference between the two often came down to a single decision, a twist of fate, or a moment when someone chose restraint over revenge. Thank you for watching.